Hi guys and welcome back to my channel. The case that I'm going to be looking into today is the case of Sally Anne Bowman. It was back in 2005 when she was literally killed, honestly, on her doorstep as she was just about to go inside by pretty much a random stranger. And it's just so heartbreaking that she was so close to being in safety and then she was just taken away. This case was suggested by Jonathan, so thank you for that. I appreciate any suggestions you guys have. And of course, if you have any more, please do let me know. Sally Anne Bowman was born on the 11th of September in 1987 to parents Paul and Linda in Cashleton, London. She had quite a decent sized family. She was the youngest of 4 children with 3 older sisters. We have Nicole, Michelle and Danielle. Sally Anne was just a very sweet girl. She knew exactly what she wanted in life and she went for it. She was very independent, like fiercely independent. She actually moved out in her teens, you know, to her own place because she just wanted to basically, and she wanted to do it all herself. And she thrived at that. She was very much described as being a natural born performer. She literally enjoyed nothing more than singing, dancing, acting, I don't know, putting on a show for people and making people happy, and she had such a talent for it and she just did really well. She went to a school for performing arts which she was accepted into. It's had a lot of famous people come from that school. It's pretty sort of prestigious and it was an amazing thing, amazing feat, challenge, no, okay, I can't even think of the words, but you know what I mean, that she actually got a chance to go to this school and she had such high prospects from that as well. She also had a very successful modelling career. She would frequently go to, you know, bars and do karaoke, and she just seemingly had it all. She was brimming with confidence. She had a really bright future ahead of her. At the time, she was also working as a part-time hairdresser, and she was catching the eye of everyone. Like, magazines were catching her. She had a dream of going on Vogue, I believe, which people assumed that it might not actually be that far away because all these magazines were catching sight of her modelling, and apparently a modelling agency, another modelling agency wanted to sign her up. But not only was all of that a passion, you know, that was what she wanted to do in life, that was a hobby, she was also very family orientated and very friend orientated. She, even though she moved out pretty early on in her teens, she would always go down to her mum's and she would always leave it not too long before she would visit again, kind of thing. She absolutely loved her family and they were all very close. She was in like a very rocky relationship with a guy called Lewis Sproston. Now, just before she was actually murdered, their relationship had ended a couple of weeks ago, I believe. It was very much an on-off relationship the entire time that we were together, by the sounds of it. It seems like he couldn't trust her, she couldn't trust him. She figured that he was out flirting with other people, he figured she was, and they would just argue a lot, I guess, from that. They would bicker, they would wind each other up. It was just very up and down, but it was typical teenager romance, I guess. Nothing sinister or anything like that, just sort of bickering. Now let's skip forward to the 24th of September in 2005. Sally had actually spent the day at her mum's house. Again, she lived on her own, but she would often go around to her mum, so she was there, spending the day there, and then Nicole, one of her sisters, actually rings her and asks if she wants to come out with her and her friend for, I believe it was a friend's birthday, something like that. So she goes and meets her at 10 PM outside Lloyd's bar. And the CCTV in the bar, you can see her having an amazing time. She's having so much fun, she's dancing, she's just totally enjoying herself. By 1 AM though, they decided that they were going to go round to her sister's, so off they go. And then Sally Anne actually decides that she wants to talk to Lewis and speak to him, bearing in mind they weren't together at this point, but she contacts him, seeing if he will like pick her up. He reluctantly kind of agrees. It was like 2 AM and they weren't even together, so he does agree to go. So he picks her up. She leaves the house, I believe. He didn't actually pick her up from that house, so I believe she went back into town or something like that. Charlton or something. That might be completely wrong. I've probably just plucked that out of nowhere and I apologise if I have. Just ignore the Charlton thing. Might not even be true. But yeah, he picks her up from somewhere else It was like after 2:30, and it was the Croydon Town Centre. Yeah, so Charlton, don't know where I got that from. It begins with a C. That's all I can guess. I don't know. But yeah, picks her up from there. They get in the car, and he's, again, with the tensions of them breaking up, probably a bit of tension that he didn't really want to go and get her in the first place because it was super late. They begin arguing and bickering, and they argue for hours as he like drives her home. Or, well, not for hours as he drives her home. She doesn't live hours away. I mean, they're arguing as he's driving her home, and then they sit outside in the car, continuing to argue outside of her house, basically. Now, this is when Lewis actually has stated in something I read that when he actually looks back on all this, he believed that whilst they were arguing, he saw a man looking into the car. Now, obviously at the time didn't think much of it, or maybe thought he was a weirdo or something, but then maybe this man disappeared and then they carried on arguing, just didn't consider it anymore after that, but he did claim that that's what he saw. So at this point, it was like, I don't know, 4 a.m, past 4 a.m, and Lewis had had enough, basically. So Sally and Anne gets out of the car and she starts heading towards her house. He watches as she's like 10 feet away, and then he drives off thinking she's safe, she's gonna go in the house, there's gonna be no issues, I'm leaving, and he leaves. And I can't pretend to know what Lewis went through after that, or whether this is something that actually happened, but on a personal note, that would have been a decision that would haunt me for the rest of my life, because Sally Anne actually never made it into her house. She was murdered before she could even get there. And not that that's his fault. Sometimes you think, oh, they're almost there, I'll just go. You wouldn't ever think that somebody, during that little short distance, something so horrific could happen to someone. But sadly it does, and it did. At 4:15 a.m, like barely 10 feet away from her front door, somebody brutally attacked Sally Anne. This man was armed with a knife, and he stabbed her in the stomach and neck area like several times. He also bit her like several times, which did leave DNA, so they did have that from it. And some of the penetrative wounds was really deep. They went all the way through, which is just horrific. And then I believe that he actually assaulted her posthumously, which is just also horrific. Sally Anne was screaming. Of course she was screaming, and a neighbour actually heard this. They heard like a blood-curdling noise, like probably blood coming out of her, I guess. I don't know what, you know what I mean. And then they heard a scream. So they went and actually looked out of the window, and they did see a man walking down the street in like a hurry, but they didn't see anything else, and so just figured that it was nothing kind of thing. That's all they saw, and so they went back to bed. After he legged it, he took her phone, some of her clothes, and her bag with him. Probably like some sort of sick trophy. Then at 6 a.m, one of the neighbours stumbles across the horrific scene. I don't know if it's she or he, I'm not sure. But they actually stumble, well, they see behind a skip what looks like mannequin legs. I've seen this so many times in these cases, because obviously the person is deceased, so they must go really pale and white. And then they see an unmoving thing and they just think it's a mannequin. It happens a lot. But yeah, she thought it was mannequin legs. She goes up to it and she realises that actually it is not in fact mannequin legs. It is much worse than that. It is a partially naked body of Sally Anne, her neighbour, who was literally so close to her doorstep. It's unbelievable, and she was like behind a skip. Obviously the police were called, and they go around to Sally Anne's mother's house, asking if, you know, she knew what. Basically, she entered the door thinking that it was Sally Anne, because she'd gotten locked out and that it was expecting her daughter to be there, but she was actually greeted with police officers instead, and told the absolutely devastating news about her youngest daughter, which is so heartbreaking. Sally Anne was literally only 18 years old. So the investigation began, and police were looking everywhere that they could to try and find this person that had killed Sally Anne. And of course, Lewis was going to be a main suspect straight away. The boyfriend, essentially the last person to have seen her, well, the ex-boyfriend at this point. Maybe he was begrudged that she didn't want him anymore. Don't know whoever he split up, she split up, or it was amicable, but you know what I mean. They always look at the boyfriend or the husband first. They actually arrested Lewis and brought him in for questioning. They took his DNA, they tested his DNA. Lewis claimed that he didn't even know that Sally Anne was murdered until the police came to talk to him, basically. And when his DNA came back, it proved that Lewis was not the one that actually killed Sally Anne. It didn't match, so he was released. He was interviewed over like 4 days as well. They really, really thought it was him, but it wasn't. Something that the lab did find, though, was that when testing the DNA, they found that it actually matched a case back in 2001. It was an indecent exposure case of a woman who was making a telephone call, and this man came up to her and did some stuff, gross stuff, you know what I mean, to himself, and then just walked away. Just honestly. Okay. But it matched that. So clearly, within that time, this is 4 years later, he's now murdered someone. He is escalating, and they're thinking, well, what else could he have done in that time? If he's gone from that, like, indecent public exposure to murder, that's a big leap. So they're thinking, well, what's he done in between all them years? And the fact that he had escalated so much from that, and the potential that he could do it again, they really, really wanted to find him now. Not that they didn't want to find him before. I'm not trying to say that. Please don't think that. They obviously did. But now that they're tying in that it isn't just like one murder, that he did this years ago and now it's escalating, they were just expecting him to do it again, kind of thing. Police were then informed of another attack that had happened the same night that Sally was murdered on a different woman, not far away from where Sally was, and hours before Sally's attack. Sally Anne, I keep calling her Sally, sorry, Sally Anne. And this man just randomly approached her, apologised to her, and then just started beating on her. Luckily, a taxi driver came and interrupted him. He ran off and basically scared this woman who was on the phone to one of her friends or something like that. He took her phone as well. So he took her phone, and the friend on the other end was actually still on the line. So she could hear the screaming from her friend, and this guy was still creeping around because it wasn't getting further away. If you're running away from someone, you're hanging onto this phone, the screams that were loud would get more and more distance. More and more distant and quieter the further you got away, but they weren't. So he was clearly hiding in a bush or something, creeping around to see what happened next, to see whether this woman would be left alone again. But luckily, she wasn't. The taxi driver had more sense than that. He got her into the cab, and then they took her to the hospital and got medical attention for her. Because it's truly believed that if that didn't happen and that taxi driver did not come, then she probably would have been the victim as well. The police were convinced that this was the same attacker as the one that killed Sally Anne, and they really did hope that that would bring a lead in the case, but it sadly didn't. They began appealing to males and appealing to people, well, just males, to come forward to give their DNA so that they could try and get matched. They kind of knew that the person who did this isn't going to willingly come forward and give his DNA because he's going to be caught then, obviously. Excuse me. So, but they were hoping that maybe a brother or a dad or some relative would, and they would get a partial DNA match or something like that, and then they could figure out who it was from that. They did it on all of these different men, and sadly still nothing happened and nothing came from it. Now, something I did forget to mention, actually, the woman who was attacked did an e-fit of the man. I believe the one in 2001, the police went to her and asked to do an e-fit of him. She did. She gave like a pretty good description of him and did an e-fit of him. And I'm not entirely sure whether the woman who he beat up did an e-fit of him too. I can't remember that one. Sorry about that. But months passed by and still nobody was any wiser as to who did this to Sally Anne. 6 months go by and the police finally get a break in their case. This was when a man named Mark Dixie was arrested outside of this pub. Basically, he was watching the football match or something or other, and he got into this argument with this other guy. They took it outside. The CCTV caught it all. Mark's pushing him around and ends up pushing him on the floor, and a police officer that was in the area actually arrests Mark. They take him in for questioning. They take fingerprints, DNA, which at that point was mandatory, because before that it wasn't mandatory to take DNA off people. They never did it, which is why sadly a lot of crimes are unsolved, because this person may have been arrested 20 times before, but if they don't have the DNA on file, then they ain't gonna match it, basically. And that's kind of the same thing that happened with Mark. He had an extensive criminal history, but had never been inputted into the DNA system until now. And this was in 2006 at that point. So they let him go on bail. Obviously, his charges were very minor. They did say that the officers found it weird that because the the charges were very minor, of how like nervous and things he looked. They just found it a bit weird, but there you go, didn't think too much of it. And then it came back that his DNA was a match to the DNA found on Sally Anne's body. So Mark Dixie was the one who had killed her. They had literally unknowingly caught him and then let him go. I mean, he fled to like Amsterdam or something, but then he ended up coming back after so long, and he'd actually, in the interview, had actually told the police where he was living because he worked as a chef outside of a pub. And I believe he was staying there too. So what they did is they knew that he was back in the country, and they went there and they had to try and lure him out of the pub because obviously he was a chef. So, not obviously, I didn't actually tell you that. So he was a chef at this pub. And obviously he has access to knives. And they don't want to put themselves in danger. Of course they don't. So they're going to try and lure him out of there, away from anything he could potentially use as a weapon. And just get him out in the open. But as they're like figuring out a plan, figuring what they can do, he just walks out of the side entrance and they arrest him there and then. That was on the 28th of June 2006. They'd finally caught Sally Anne's killer. And basically it seems that Mark had been out on a night out with his friends. He was drinking, he was taking drugs. Apparently it was his birthday and he was expecting his girlfriend to have done something big for it, but she didn't. This is when he got mad at that. He carried on partying for a bit and then he went back to like a girl's flat where his friends and stuff were all going, like an after party I guess. Stayed there for a while, and then this is when he left, and that is when he stumbled across Sally Anne and he just murdered her. I don't know, he murdered her. 10 feet away from her own doorstep. Well, sorry, he attacked the woman first and then murdered Sally. Yeah, sorry about that. He went to trial on the 22nd of February 2008. He was found guilty of the murder of Sally Anne Bowman and sentenced to life in prison with a recommendation of 34 years. Now, that would mean that he would be considered for parole in 2040. I hope that he never gets out, to be honest, because clearly he is very unhinged. He should, in my eyes at least, not be released back into society. He also had an extensive criminal history, like I said before that. A lot of assault on women, a lot of all these things were burglary, aggravated assault, things like that, you know. So he was definitely escalating. And it's just devastating that it eventually led to the murder of Sally Anne. Thank goodness he was caught. Obviously, he was a very dangerous man. Personally, hope that he never gets out, but there you go. We'll have to see, I guess, in like 20 years' time, which is a long time. Yeah, that is the end of the case. So if you guys have enjoyed this video, give me a big thumbs up, subscribe to the channel for similar content. Anyway, that's all I have today on the case of Sally Anne Bowman. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, bye!